A wolf soulmate romance written by Clara Nightshade. Prologue. One human girl. One savage prince. One bond that defies fate. When Evelyn Hartwood adopts a wounded black dog in the heart of Snowvale Forest, she has no idea she's taken home a beast, one with golden eyes, ancient blood, and a claim that runs deeper than time itself. Lucian Blackmore isn't just any werewolf. He's the youngest prince of a brutal wolf monarchy, cursed with amnesia and ruled by primal instincts. To him, Evelyn isn't just a savior. She's his mate. His only. His forever. Dragged into a savage kingdom where humans are prey and wolves mate for life, Evelyn must fight for her freedom, her identity, and the growing bond with the dangerously possessive creature who follows her like a shadow and would kill to protect her. But darker forces stir beyond the Ironfang Keep. A tyrant king thirsts for Evelyn's hidden power, a prophecy whispers of blood and fire, and a love written in stars may be the only thing strong enough to break a curse forged centuries ago. Chapter 1: The Lost Dog. The snow had a way of muting the world. Every crunch of Evelyn's boots sank into the silence like an apology, swallowed by the towering pine trees and frost-covered brambles that lined the forgotten trail. Her breath fogged in the crisp mountain air, cheeks reddened with the sting of cold. She hadn't meant to stray this far from the cabin, but the stillness of Snowvale Forest was almost meditative until the clouds shifted and dusk arrived too soon. And that was when she heard it. A whimper. Barely a sound. Yet distinct enough to cut through the hush of snowfall. Evelyn froze, hand tightening on her scarf. There it was again, soft, desperate. Not the howl of a wild wolf, but something more vulnerable. She moved off the trail, boots crunching through underbrush and over fallen logs, heart thudding faster with every step. Her flashlight flickered across tangled roots and silver-dusted moss until it landed on a heap of fur, crumpled beneath a low-hanging fir. A black dog. No, too large for a dog. Bigger than any breed she'd ever seen, with limbs coiled in pain and fur matted by ice and dirt. One glowing eye blinked up at her, molten gold against the snow's white. "Hey, hey," she whispered, crouching low. "You're okay." The creature didn't growl. Didn't flee. It whimpered again, paw twitching as though broken. Evelyn moved slowly, pulling off her gloves. The fur beneath her fingers was coarse and warm despite the cold, muscles trembling beneath her touch. "You poor thing," she murmured, brushing snow from its muzzle. "Where did you come from?" It didn't answer, of course, but something about the way it looked at her made her chest tighten. Like it knew her. Like it had been waiting. She named him Shadow. It felt fitting, considering his silent presence and those luminous eyes that followed her everywhere once she managed to coax him back to her small mountain cabin. He limped beside her without complaint, leaning into her leg when the wind picked up, and collapsed onto her front porch the moment she unlocked the door. "You're definitely not normal," she muttered, lifting his heavy frame with effort. "That, or I've been reading too many fantasy novels." Shadow curled beside the fireplace as though he owned the place, soaking in the warmth with a grateful sigh. Evelyn sat cross-legged beside him with a bowl of water and the remnants of last night's stew. He sniffed at both but only drank the water. "I'll see if I can get some meat tomorrow. I didn't exactly plan for guests." He stared at her, ears twitching. One of them looked torn, scarred from a past fight. His body was lean, not emaciated, but old wounds ran beneath the thick coat. He'd been through hell, that much was obvious. Evelyn reached out to touch his paw. Shadow allowed it. "Guess we're both a little lost." That night, Evelyn dreamed of wolves. Massive beasts with silver eyes circled her beneath a crimson moon. Their howls were mournful, echoing across snowy peaks. One of them stood apart, black-furred, eyes glowing gold. It approached her slowly, not as a predator, but as something ancient. Familiar. When she reached out, it bowed its head. She woke tangled in blankets, heart racing. Shadow was no longer beside the hearth. Panic surged as she sat up, but then she saw him, perched on the windowsill like a statue. Watching the night, unmoving, as if he were guarding her from something only he could sense. The fire flickered low. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Shadow turned to look at her. And she swore, just for a second, those golden eyes were almost human. The next morning, Evelyn found Shadow curled up on the mat beside the front door, tail twitching as if he'd spent the night dreaming of battles or bones, or possibly both. She knelt beside him, fingers brushing against the thick fur at the scruff of his neck. It was softer than she remembered. Warmer, too, like some small furnace disguised as a canine. "Okay, big guy. Let's do a damage report." He opened one golden eye, unamused. Evelyn's fingers gently examined his limbs, her touch skimming over muscles that felt unusual. Not the wiry tension she'd expect from a wild dog, but something denser, more refined, like the difference between a long-distance runner and a soldier. There were healing wounds, yes, but beneath them was a body adapted for something more than simple survival. "This is the part where I wish I'd actually gone to vet school," she muttered, mentally cataloguing the strange symmetry of his bone structure, the peculiar proportions of his hind legs, and the almost humanoid articulation of his shoulders. She pulled back slightly. "You're not exactly standard issue Canis Lupus familiaris, are you?" Shadow blinked. If a dog could look smug, he absolutely did. They spent the better part of the day not doing much of anything, which, under the circumstances, Evelyn considered a triumph. She brewed coffee. Shadow refused to go near the smell. She chopped wood. He watched, head tilted as if judging her form. When she retrieved a copy of Molecular Biology of the Cell to reread for the 5th time out of sheer boredom, he huffed like a bored TA stuck in an undergrad seminar. "You know," she said as she turned a page, "there's a fascinating principle in molecular mimicry. Pathogens evolve proteins that closely resemble the host's, which helps them evade the immune system." Shadow said nothing, of course. But his eyes met hers. Unblinking. Golden curious and, oddly enough, a little offended. She snapped the book shut. "I'm just saying, if you're some weird forest cryptid mimicking a dog to infiltrate human society, you're doing a bang-up job." He stood up, shook out his coat, and wandered off to curl beside the fire again. If dogs could roll their eyes, she was certain he would've. Outside, snow had begun to fall in earnest. The thick kind that turned everything into a world of muffled white. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch in her parka, sipping the last of her lukewarm coffee. Snowvale was usually quiet this time of year, just trees, ice, and the occasional deer stubborn enough to pick a fight with winter. She liked the silence. Had, in fact, come here for it. But now, with Shadow curled behind the door like a sentinel, it didn't feel like solitude anymore. It felt tenuous. Like the hush before a symphony or the shallow inhale of someone about to speak. As though the forest itself was waiting. Evelyn wrapped her arms tighter around herself. By evening, it was official. Shadow had no plans to leave. Not that she'd been actively pushing him out, but he hadn't so much as scratched at the door. He was content to follow her from room to room like a large, intimidating shadow, hence the name, and collapse onto her feet anytime she so much as paused for longer than 5 seconds. When she brushed her teeth, he was there. When she attempted yoga to work out the cabin fever kinks in her spine, he lay beside her mat like a giant, brooding weight. When she finally crawled into bed tired, achy, and mildly irked at her complete lack of internet access, he followed her into the bedroom and dropped down beside the bed with a grunt that sounded suspiciously like "This is mine now." "You're not sleeping up here," she warned, pointing at the mattress. "We just met. I don't even let Tinder matches past the couch." He yawned, showed all his very sharp teeth, and promptly rolled onto his side with an air of aristocratic finality. That night, she didn't dream of wolves. She dreamed of heat, searing, impossible heat, like standing in the heart of a fire that breathed. She was running barefoot through the snow, heart thudding as fast as a hummingbird's wings. Behind her was something massive. Not chasing her. Not hunting. Just following. Steady. Inevitable. In the dream, she turned around and it was him. Not Shadow, not the dog. A man. Black hair, eyes the same deep gold. Broad shoulders, lean frame, naked and unashamed beneath the moonlight. His skin gleamed like obsidian licked with frost. There was something ancient in his gaze, something that reached for her not with hands, but with memory. He opened his mouth to speak. And she woke up gasping. Shadow was on the bed. Correction, Shadow was half on the bed, forepaws crossed neatly over the edge, his massive head nestled against her hip. His fur was damp with melted snow. The scent of pine and frost clung to him like perfume. She stared at him, mind still fogged with dream logic and the surreal intimacy of golden eyes staring into her soul. "You climbed up," she said weakly. "You know you're not allowed." He didn't move. She should have pushed him off. Should have asserted some boundaries, basic house training, for heaven's sake. But her arm moved instead, burying fingers in the thick ruff of his neck, and he exhaled against her ribs with the kind of exhausted relief that felt like more than mere animal instinct. Evelyn didn't fall asleep so much as drift. There was something about the way his body curled around hers, protective, possessive, as if she were something precious he'd nearly lost. Something he intended never to lose again. Chapter 2 Under the Moonlight. The third night began like any other in Snowvale, meaning it involved Evelyn making a half-hearted attempt at cooking with canned lentils, reading 30 pages of Origins of Species purely out of guilt, and making idle conversation with a very large dog who continued to defy veterinary logic, canine behavior studies, and her increasingly fragile grip on reality. Shadow had taken to pacing at the windows whenever the sun dipped low. Not pacing like an anxious pet, but like a guard. His head would snap toward the forest line every time a branch creaked or the wind howled, muscles taut under that glossy black coat like he was preparing for war or an unusually dramatic weather report. Evelyn set down her mug of tea, watching him with the caution of a woman who'd just realized her roommate might be a little intense. "You good, buddy?" she asked, crossing the room slowly. He didn't glance at her. Instead, he pushed his nose to the glass and released a low sound, a rumble, really, deep and layered with meaning she couldn't decipher but instinctively knew wasn't a growl. More like a warning. A herald of something ancient stirring in the dark. And that's when she noticed it, the moon. Suspended in the sky like a silver coin held between the fingers of some celestial god, perfectly full and unnaturally luminous. It cast the entire clearing in an ethereal sheen, bathing Shadow in light that made his fur shimmer like ink rippling across a still lake. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. Because he wasn't just a dog. Not entirely. She stepped outside without thinking, coat forgotten, the cold biting instantly at her skin. But her focus wasn't on the temperature, it was on Shadow, who followed her out silently, not at her heels this time but beside her, shoulder brushing against her thigh in a way that felt deliberate. Protective. The world was too quiet. No rustle of squirrels, no flutter of night birds. Even the wind had paused, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. Evelyn tilted her head up to the sky, arms wrapped around herself, and murmured, "Weird moon tonight." Shadow didn't respond. But then, movement. He walked a few feet ahead, into the open glade that bordered the tree line. The moonlight touched him like a spotlight, illuminating the sleek muscles beneath his fur, the subtle glint of claws, the unnatural fluidity of his stride. And then he stopped. Evelyn took a cautious step forward. "Shadow." He turned to face her. His eyes, still golden, locked onto hers, and suddenly, everything changed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no bursts of light, no cinematic sound effects or CGI-level bone cracking. Just a quiet ripple across his body, like reality blinking. One moment, he was a wolf-like dog. The next, he was not. Still on all fours. Still cloaked in black fur. But longer. Taller. More upright. The shape of his spine elongated, his limbs restructured. His face became less canine and more something else, something closer to human, but feral and wild and laced with an intelligence that chilled her to the marrow. And those eyes, they never left hers. Golden. Unflinching. Familiar in a way that scraped against the edges of her memory. Evelyn didn't scream. Her brain, ever the overachiever, sprinted through every available explanation. Radiation-induced mutation, ancient forest deity, lab experiment gone rogue, an evolutionary offshoot no one had classified yet. But underneath all the scientific scrambling was something simpler. Older. Recognition. "Who are you?" she whispered, stepping back despite herself. He didn't speak. But he moved. Not toward her, not away. Just stood there in the moonlight, something primal and broken and beautiful. His chest rose and fell in sharp, deliberate breaths, and his nostrils flared like he was committing the scent of her fear, or maybe her presence, to memory. Then, slowly, he dropped to one knee. A gesture that should have seemed human but instead felt instinctive. Submissive. Evelyn's throat went dry. Shadow. A low sound emerged, half growl, half word. Garbled, hoarse. Lucian. She blinked. What? He clutched his chest suddenly, collapsing to the snow. His body spasmed once, then again, and for the first time since finding him, Evelyn felt true fear not of him, but for him. Because he was changing again. It was more painful this time. She could see it in the way his body contorted, bones snapping, flesh reshaping. The sound was wet and raw and filled the clearing with a kind of brutal honesty nature rarely displayed so publicly. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside him, hands reaching out before she could think better of it. Hey. Hey, it's okay, she said, voice shaking. He whimpered. Not like a dog. Like a man caught between two forms, muscles tearing themselves apart in pursuit of an ancient biological truth. Her palm found his shoulder, human now, not furred. Fever hot and trembling. Lucian, she whispered. If that's your name, you need to fight it. Breathe through it. Focus. He stilled. Not all at once, but like a ripple quieting on water, the spasms ceased. His breathing slowed. The limbs that had twisted so violently now trembled with a different kind of tension, exhaustion, maybe, or restraint. And then, he was still. Curled on his side in the snow, naked and silent, save for the whisper of his breath. Evelyn exhaled shakily. Okay. So. Not a dog. Evelyn had seen plenty of strange things in her 28 years, bioluminescent fungi, a freshman eat 6 bananas in 1 minute to impress his lab partner, and once, a moose with 2 different colored antlers, but none of them held a candle to the man currently unconscious and very naked in the snow outside her cabin. Which, okay, was a ridiculous thing to be thinking right now, given the circumstances. The rational part of her brain, the one trained on evolutionary biology and empirical methodology, was firing off sirens like a Vegas slot machine. Unknown entity, unstable physiology, possibly contagious. And yet, there she was, shrugging off her coat and draping it over him before the cold could bite any deeper into his skin. Not because he'd been a dog, sort of. Not because he'd said her name or maybe his name in a voice that sounded like gravel and memory. But because he'd looked at her with something that felt terrifyingly close to recognition. Evelyn knelt beside him in the snow, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse, strong, steady, human. Mostly. The coat was too short to fully cover him, so she shifted it down toward his hips. Objectively speaking, he was built like some sculptor's fever dream, lean muscles that spoke of survival, not vanity, a sharpness to his features like he'd been carved from obsidian and regret. And there, on his shoulder blade, a mark raised and faintly glowing under the moonlight. A sigil. Or maybe a scar. Possibly both. You're going to have a hell of a time explaining this in the morning, she muttered, then added, because it felt necessary, assuming you can talk in full sentences. He woke an hour later, teeth chattering, eyes unfocused, limbs twitching like a creature halfway through metamorphosis. Evelyn had dragged him back inside by then, somehow, using a sleeping bag as a makeshift sled and every ounce of survival muscle she'd built during her solo hiking phase. She'd parked him on the couch, swaddled in blankets, and was currently hovering with a pot of tea in one hand and a bottle of Tylenol in the other, which was possibly the most aggressively human response to what had to be a supernatural event. His gaze was heavy when it finally landed on her, like he had to drag it through some thick mental fog. Those golden eyes, still burning, even without the moonlight, locked onto her with slow, deliberate intensity. Hi, she said, because what else could one reasonably open with? He flinched slightly at the sound, nostrils flaring, like the word itself had sent. You're safe, she added, lowering her voice. You're here. In my cabin. And I don't know what you are, exactly, but I didn't leave you out there to freeze, so you owe me at least a name. Preferably species. Blood type optional. He blinked. Then, slowly, so slowly, his lips parted. Seen, he rasped. The word was broken but whole, like it had been buried deep and only just dug its way out. Lucian. The name settled around her like snow. He didn't speak again for hours, but he watched as if memorizing her presence, mapping the room through the lens of scent and sound more than sight. He flinched when she approached too quickly, but didn't recoil when she touched his arm to check for fever. His body ran hot, unnaturally so, but not in a way that seemed dangerous. More like combustion in slow motion. And then there was the way he looked at her. Not like a stranger. Not like a man trying to make sense of a new place. But like someone who'd found something he'd been chasing for a long, long time. Okay, Evelyn muttered as she perched on the arm of a nearby chair, sipping lukewarm tea and pretending her pulse wasn't doing the samba. You're either some lost cryptid with excellent cheekbones or a government experiment that escaped Area 51. Which is, honestly, fine. I've always wanted to be the person who discovers a new species. I just figured I'd be wearing gloves and standing in a lab, not hosting a post-shift werewolf on my couch. Lucian didn't flinch at the word werewolf. She narrowed her eyes. Is that what you are? You don't have to transform at the full moon and eat villagers to qualify, you know. Definitions are flexible. Still no answer. But he shifted under the blanket, curling slightly in on himself, and murmured something low and garbled. She leaned in. What? He tried again, voice ragged. Smell. Evelyn blinked. Okay. Vague. What about it? He took a long inhale through his nose, slow, deliberate, and so pointed it made her freeze. Yours, he whispered. It wasn't a question. Her heart stumbled. She set the tea aside with careful precision. Mine, what? Lucian's gaze drifted toward her, drowsy and possessive in a way that felt far too intimate for someone who'd spent most of their acquaintance as a four-legged freeloader. His eyes moved across her face, pausing at her mouth, her neck, her hand still clutching the tea like a lifeline. Safe, he murmured. Evelyn swallowed. Her voice came out much thinner than she wanted. You mean you feel safe? He blinked, like he was trying to translate the thought into language, then slowly, agonizingly, shook his head. You are safe. For me. And for some completely inexplicable reason, her throat burned at that. The rest of the night passed in a haze of silence and science-defying revelations. She offered him water and he drank it like he hadn't had any in years. He sniffed everything before touching it. He didn't like overhead lights, flinched at silver objects, and curled his lip at her electric heater like it had personally offended him. And he never, not once, broke eye contact with her unless he absolutely had to. By dawn, Evelyn had reviewed every possible explanation in her mental Rolodex. Viral mutation? Too specific. Genetic experiment? Unlikely, his cells would have lysed from instability by now. A cryptozoological remnant of some ancient hominin-wolf hybrid? Sure. Let's go with that. She stared at him as the first light of morning touched the window. He was sleeping again, finally, curled in a way that was far too human to be a coincidence. Lucian. Whatever he was, whoever he used to be, he was hers now. And that realization should have scared her. But instead, it felt like gravity. Chapter 3 Snowvale Wilderness. By the fifth day, Evelyn had come to several conclusions. 1. Lucian, assuming that was his real name and not some dramatic pseudonym borrowed from a Victorian penny dreadful, was not going to eat her. Statistically speaking, if he were going to devour her whole, he'd have done it by now. Preferably before she caught him stealing her last protein bar or attempting to gnaw on the fireplace tongs. 2. He healed fast. Like, unreasonably fast. A wound she'd noticed on his ribs, a deep gouge, probably from some clawed thing she didn't want to imagine too closely, had scabbed over within a day. Now, it was nothing but a faint scar, the kind you only saw if you looked closely, which, okay, she had. For science. Obviously. 3. He didn't speak much. Words were a struggle, each one felt hard-won, as if his mouth were catching up to a brain trained to communicate with growls and body language. But the few words he did use, she hoarded them like rare specimens. And for, perhaps the most alarming of all, he liked to watch her sleep. Which, under normal circumstances, would be the opening to a horror story. But Lucian didn't watch like a predator. He watched like, he was afraid she'd vanish if he blinked. The cabin's woodpile was running low, and Evelyn knew better than to let herself or Lucian freeze to death just because the forest outside looked like the set of a climate disaster documentary. She pulled on her coat, triple-layered her socks, and strapped on the snowshoes she'd smugly bought 2 years ago at an REI clearance sale. Lucian stood in the doorway, shirtless of course and barefoot also of course, like snow was merely an aesthetic inconvenience. He tilted his head at her layers with mild confusion. "You do know humans die of hypothermia, right?" she called out, adjusting her gloves. "We're tragically fragile. Evolution failed us hard." He didn't respond, but she saw the flicker of amusement at the corner of his mouth. It was still strange seeing expressions on that face. Strange and undeniably fascinating. "Stay here," she added, gesturing at the cabin. "I'll be 20 minutes. Tops." Lucian stepped forward. Evelyn sighed. "You don't have to follow me everywhere, you know. It's not like I'm being hunted by." She stopped. He was staring at her with that look again. The one that made her feel like she was the axis of some ancient compass. It was warm, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "Okay," she muttered, grabbing her pack. "Field trip it is." The forest was quieter than usual, muffled by heavy snow and the slow descent of powder from the branches overhead. Lucian moved like he belonged to the wild, silent, efficient, sure-footed. She, in contrast, was fairly confident she looked like a goose on stilts. Every few steps, she sank awkwardly into a drift and had to flail her arms to regain balance, which Lucian observed with undisguised curiosity and approximately zero assistance. "You know, helping me once wouldn't kill you," she grumbled, winded. He reached over and casually yanked her out of a waist-high pile of snow with one hand. "Thanks," she said, both grateful and miffed. He made a low sound that might have been a chuckle. They reached a fallen pine after 10 minutes old, dry, and perfect for cutting. Evelyn unpacked her folding saw and set to work, while Lucian crouched beside her like some sort of vigilant gargoyle, eyes constantly scanning the woods. "You always like this?" she asked without looking up. "Tense? Protective? Mildly homicidal when I so much as walk out the door?" He didn't answer immediately. "Not always," he said finally, voice husky from disuse. She paused. "So you do have a sense of humor." He tilted his head. "You're strange. That's rich coming from you." They carried the wood back in silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant caw of a raven. Evelyn couldn't help but glance over at him every few seconds. His bare back flexed with each step, scars and old bruises etched into the skin like some warrior's biography. It should have been intimidating. And maybe it was. But it was also grounding. A reminder that this wild, inhuman creature had bled and suffered, too. When they returned, she built the fire while Lucian prowled the interior like a bored panther, sniffing at the walls as if they'd shifted in his absence. "You do know it's a log cabin, right? It's not going to run away." He didn't answer, but he did pause beside the window and press his palm against the glass. Watching the snow. Listening to something she couldn't hear. Something about that image struck her unexpectedly hard. "You remember anything yet?" she asked softly. He didn't turn. "Flashes. Of what?" Lucian's fingers twitched against the frost-lined pane. "Running. Blood. A woman's voice. The sea." Evelyn swallowed. "That's weirdly poetic. I don't know who I am." His voice was low, clipped. "But I remember you." Her breath caught. He turned then, finally, golden eyes boring into her like sunrise after a long, starless night. "I knew you. Before." Evelyn's rational mind reeled. Neural imprinting? Trauma-based memory loops? Spiritual déjà vu? Her heart, however, just whispered yes. Later that evening, after the snow had settled like powdered sugar over the treetops and Lucian had eaten approximately 2 pounds of pan-seared venison with the enthusiasm of a man recently introduced to the concept of seasoning, Evelyn found herself staring at the fire, pretending not to be hyper-aware of the very large, very shirtless werewolf reclining on her rug like it was the height of sophistication. He hadn't said much since the memory comment, just sat near her, quietly observant, like the cabin's old wooden beams might whisper secrets if he listened closely enough. Occasionally, his eyes flicked to her. Not in the casual, friendly kind of way. More like he was memorizing her every micro-expression, filing them away under a folder labeled mine. She pulled the knit throw tighter around her shoulders and cleared her throat. So, you're remembering things now. Random sensory fragments and cryptic references to women and oceans. That's comforting. He tilted his head, lips twitching faintly. You mock. Only because I'm terrified, she replied sweetly. But, you know, in a functional, science-forward kind of way. He seemed to ponder that. You hide fear. With words. Evelyn blinked. Well, that's uncomfortably accurate. Lucian shifted onto one elbow, propping himself up. The firelight caught the curve of his jaw and the long shadows of his collarbones. She averted her eyes. Not because he wasn't objectively beautiful in the way that mythological mistakes tend to be, but because he noticed when she looked. He always noticed. You are not prey, he said simply. It took her a second to realize he was still responding to her earlier jab. You mean I don't smell like prey? She asked, half teasing, half serious. He shook his head. No. You smell like thunder. And warmth. The edge of something sharp. She blinked again. Well, that's specific. Lucian shrugged slightly, as if describing someone's soul scent was the most natural thing in the world. The fire crackled, and Evelyn leaned forward to stoke it, grateful for something to do with her hands. She could feel him watching her again, gaze heavy and thoughtful. You were right, she murmured. I use humor as a defense mechanism. Why? Because the alternative is panicking. Or crying. Or collapsing into existential dread, which I try to limit to once a month. He nodded solemnly. Efficient. Evelyn snorted. That's one word for it. She reached for her tea and took a long sip, letting the warmth settle in her chest. The silence between them felt different tonight, not awkward, but full. Like the space between heartbeats or the pause before a confession. Her mind buzzed with questions about his past, his physiology, what he was doing in her forest, but she also recognized, instinctively, that pushing too hard would make him shut down. So instead, she asked the one question that had been quietly circling her like a satellite. Why me? Lucian looked up, brow furrowed. You said you remember me, she said, her voice softer now. You said you knew me before. But I don't know you. So if this is some magical past life soulmate thing, I'm gonna need a little more context. His eyes met hers, and something ancient flickered behind them. Not knowledge, exactly. More like grief. I don't know how, he said slowly. But I saw you. Before the cold. Before the pain. Your voice. Your eyes. You said. Find me. Evelyn's heart stumbled. I what? You were light. You were fire. You called me Lucian, and you told me to run. She was frozen, but not from fear. From recognition. A dream, no, a feeling echoed through her spine. A voice not quite hers, whispering through her sleep. Remember me. I've never said that, she said, but the denial sounded weak even to her own ears. Lucian didn't argue. He simply reached out, fingers brushing hers on the blanket. The contact was light, but electric. Not romantic. Not yet. But charged. Inevitable. I feel you, he whispered. Like scent. But deeper. Evelyn swallowed. Like entanglement. He tilted his head. Quantum entanglement, she explained, trying to find her footing through science. Two particles, linked at a subatomic level. Even if they're separated by light years, they still affect each other. Instantly. Like distance doesn't matter. Lucian's thumb brushed her wrist. Like us. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her heart was pounding far too loudly. The fire began to die down, casting the room in deeper amber. Evelyn stood slowly, crossing to the hearth to add another log. The flicker of flame jumped, lapping at the fresh wood like a tongue. Behind her, Lucian spoke. You dream of wolves. She froze. He hadn't asked. He'd stated it. Calmly. Like he knew. Evelyn turned. How do you? You call out, he said. In your sleep. Heat rushed to her cheeks. Great. So now I'm a sleep-talking woodland cryptid collector. But Lucien's expression was not amused. It was tender. I will protect you, he said simply. Evelyn felt that promise settle deep in her bones. Not a casual vow. Not words meant to soothe. But something ancient. Binding. She sat beside him, close but not touching. The silence returned, but this time, it felt like belonging. Chapter 4 Gates of Ironfang. The first sign something was wrong was the silence. Not the gentle, snow-draped quiet Evelyn had come to expect from Snowvale, but a harsher kind, void of birdsong, wind, even the muffled scamper of foxes. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful, but premeditated. Lucien noticed it first. He paused mid-step along the ridge trail, muscles locking so suddenly that Evelyn nearly bumped into him. His head lifted, nostrils flaring like a scent had just crawled out of the earth and into his lungs. "What is it?" she asked, scanning the horizon with a growing knot in her stomach. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed her hand, rough, calloused fingers closing around hers with an urgency that was both protective and deeply, unnervingly final, and pulled her behind the nearest thicket of pine. Evelyn's breath caught as she crouched beside him. His body was tense, vibrating with that same kinetic alertness she'd seen in prey animals seconds before they bolted. His eyes darted to the tree line. Gold, narrowed, hungry, but not in a way that thrilled her. This hunger was ancient and angry. Then, she heard it. A sound low and metallic. Not quite a growl, not quite a voice. Just the heavy thud of boots in snow and the sharp jingle of chains. They were not alone. The wolves came into view slowly, like predators that enjoyed being seen. Tall, armored figures with cloaks of coarse fur and helms shaped like snarling muzzles. Not costumes. Not cosplay. These were actual wolves, upright and bipedal, but still unmistakably not human. Their movements were smooth, their eyes inhuman, gleaming beneath slits in their helmets like gold coins dipped in oil. They were looking for something. Correction, they were looking for someone. Evelyn didn't move. Didn't breathe. Not even when Lucien shifted beside her, wrapping one arm around her shoulders like a shield. Not possessive this time. Just instinctual. She felt his chest rising faster, sharper. They knew him. Or he knew them. And that meant they'd likely come for him. Which probably meant they'd come for her, too. One of the guards paused, sniffing the air. He turned sharply toward the thicket, head cocked at a two-animal angle. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Lucien's hand tightened on her arm. There was no time to run. The guards struck fast. There was no warning, no shouted commands, just a sudden blur of movement and the sharp burn of a net spun from metallic fibers that hissed against Lucien's skin. Silver. It had to be. The way he cried out, raw, furious, wounded, tore through her like a blade. "Lucien," she screamed, trying to wrench herself free as two of the wolves grabbed her arms. Their grip was iron and impersonal, like they didn't even register her as a threat. Lucien fought like a cornered animal, but the net sizzled with each movement, sending ripples of pain across his skin. His body was already shifting in and out of form, joints twisting, bones cracking, like his instincts couldn't decide whether to fight as a man or a beast. "Do not kill him," one of the guards growled in a tongue she didn't recognize but somehow understood. "King's orders," another replied. They dragged her forward. Lucien thrashed again, snarling now, teeth bared, but it only seemed to amuse the guards. They hauled him to his knees, forcing a thick iron collar around his throat. Evelyn watched as the metal made contact and something in him snapped, his body going rigid, eyes rolling back. "Stop it," she shouted, kicking wildly, but the wolf gripping her arm merely growled and yanked her closer. She could feel her panic unspooling, rational thought breaking into jagged pieces. "You don't understand," she gasped. He's not dangerous. He's sick. He's injured. He's a prince," one of them snarled, yanking her forward so fast her shoulder popped. "And you're a trespasser. Both of you will answer to the king." That was when Evelyn realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an arrest. The journey through the woods blurred into a freezing, humiliating blur. The wolves didn't talk to her. They didn't feed her. They didn't care when she tripped, or when her hands went numb, or when she tried to ask what was happening. Lucien was kept ahead of her, flanked on all sides, the collar around his throat glowing faintly with symbols she couldn't decipher. His body sagged more with each step, but he never looked back. Not once. That hurt more than it should have. But she understood. This wasn't him ignoring her. This was him enduring, focusing on survival like he had in the cabin, back when his vocabulary barely extended past safe and mine. They walked for hours. Days. It felt like both. Eventually, the trees thinned, giving way to frost-covered cliffs and a trail that wound upward like a scar carved into stone. And then she saw it. Ironfang Keep. Or rather, the gates, towering slabs of blackened iron, marked with runes and reinforced with bone. Literal bone. Not decorative. Not metaphorical. Human bone. Evelyn's breath froze in her lungs. This wasn't just a fortress. It was a warning. They dragged her through the gates like a curiosity. She barely registered the rows of wolves watching from balconies and battlements, some armored, some draped in ceremonial silks, others still in hybrid forms that made her gut twist. All of them stared. At her. At Lucien. A few whispered. A few laughed. One spat in her direction. They brought her through halls of stone and firelight, past murals of battles and beasts, past braziers filled with black smoke and the sharp smell of blood and resin. The keep breathed around her, ancient, alive, and deeply, disturbingly aware. Finally, they stopped in a great hall of obsidian and bone. At the far end sat a throne made of antlers and swords. And on that throne reclined a man. Tall. Pale. Dressed in black with eyes like glacier that had never thawed. He was beautiful the way venom is, striking, impossible, and deadly. His presence filled the room like a storm system. Lucien stiffened beside her, then dropped to one knee. Not from choice. From the weight of the collar. Evelyn stared, breath caught in her throat. The man on the throne tilted his head, lips curling faintly. "Well," he said, voice like winter. "Little brother returns. And he brings a human?" His eyes found hers, and she swore the air dropped 10 degrees. How curious. It was the quiet that unsettled her the most. Not the violent capture. Not the iron collar glowing like a cursed relic. Not even the towering wolves who had flanked her down the torchlit corridor, all of them eerily quiet, disciplined, the very antithesis of the chaotic wilderness she'd come to know. No, it was this silence. The heavy, measured stillness in the great hall of Ironfang Keep. Like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what she, the human, would do. She didn't move. Not because she wasn't afraid, she was, but because instinct, or maybe something older than that, told her predators preferred movement. A twitch, a flinch, any sign of prey like weakness. Lucien knelt beside her, his head bowed under the pressure of the collar. She wanted to reach for him, to touch his shoulder, to break whatever hold it had on him. But that would have required stepping forward. And forward meant stepping closer to the man on the throne. Or the thing. Because no part of him felt human, even if his form mimicked one. He was all edges and calculation, his silver eyes so pale they looked carved from polished ash. The king, Magnus, she remembered from the guard's murmurs, smiled at her like a cat dissecting a mouse with polite interest. "You brought her here," Magnus said, gaze still pinned to Lucien, though his voice was clearly intended for Evelyn. "Curious. Not entirely surprising. But curious." "I didn't bring anyone," Evelyn replied, before she could stop herself. The court murmured. The king lifted a single brow. "She speaks." Lucien's hands clenched on the stone floor. He hadn't looked at her since they entered, but she could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. Embarrassment. Anger. Shame. "You're trespassing," Magnus continued. "On sacred territory. With a wolf prince. One who was presumed dead." Evelyn's pulse kicked into a sprint. "We didn't know." Magnus raised a hand. She fell silent. "You misunderstand. I'm not accusing you. I'm simply observing. Like a scientist might." Her lips parted, surprised, and maybe a little intrigued. "You study humans?" "I study everything." Magnus descended from his throne with slow, deliberate steps, the hem of his coat sweeping over the polished obsidian floor. You may find our kind brutal, Evelyn Hartwood, but make no mistake, we are not ignorant. We watch. We remember. We learn. The mention of her name sent a shiver down her spine. How do you know who I am? I smelled you the moment you crossed the ridge, he said, now circling slowly around her like she was a lab specimen under examination. Human. Female. Healthy. Fertile. Intelligent. Empathetic. Rare. She clenched her fists. You forgot extremely unwilling participant. He stopped behind her, so close she could feel the cold emanating from his skin. Did I? Lucien stirred beside her, head lifting, a warning in the movement. His body was still taut, his hands braced against the floor, but there was something barely contained about him now, like a storm hemmed in by glass. Don't touch her, he said, voice gravel thick and low. Magnus didn't even flinch. I won't. She's yours, isn't she? Evelyn blinked. Excuse me? The king turned toward Lucien, ignoring her entirely now. She's your mate. I can smell the bond. Unmarked, unsealed, but beginning. You clung to her scent even through silver fever. That kind of attachment is rare, even among our kind. Especially for you. Lucien said nothing. But Evelyn could feel the heat radiating from him now. Not embarrassment. Not confusion. Possession. Well. Magnus's gaze flicked back to her, curious and faintly amused. Isn't this inconvenient? Inconvenient, she echoed, incredulous. The king clasped his hands behind his back. You're a disruptor, Evelyn. A catalyst. The last thing our bloodline needs. I'm not trying to do anything, she snapped. I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know what he was until 3 days ago. And yet, he chose you. Lucien finally raised his head. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the forest, Evelyn saw something deeply, tragically familiar in his expression. Not wildness. Devotion. Her breath caught. Take them to the lower chambers, Magnus said at last, waving a hand. Evelyn stiffened. Wait, what chambers? Don't worry. You won't be harmed, the king said, turning back toward his throne. You, Evelyn Hartwood, are far too valuable. And Lucien is family. We protect what is ours. The words felt like ice. Ours. They were separated after that. No explanation. No time for protest. A female guard pulled Evelyn down a different hallway while Lucien was dragged in the opposite direction, his gaze never breaking from hers until the corridor curved and swallowed him whole. She struggled, but the guard was strong and silent. I want to see him, Evelyn said as they descended the spiraling stone steps. I need to know he's okay. The guard didn't respond. This is unlawful imprisonment, you know, she tried again. You can't just throw people in dungeons because they smelled interesting. Still nothing. They reached a chamber lit by a single lantern, circular, carved into the earth, with walls covered in moss and faintly glowing fungal veins. It smelled of stone and old salt. Not a prison, exactly. More like a holding cell designed to look deceptively organic. The guard handed her a cloak, then turned and left. Evelyn stood alone, heart racing, skin damp with fear and cold and something else she couldn't quite name. Lucien was gone. The forest was behind her. And in front of her, above her, was a kingdom built on blood, hierarchy, and secrets. But somewhere inside it, he was waiting. And she would find him. Chapter 5 The Wolf Court. Evelyn had been told once, by an ex-boyfriend who majored in evolutionary psychology and condescension, that most social hierarchies boil down to one thing: power display. Wolves baring their throats, CEOs cutting off mid-sentence, toddlers throwing tantrums in Whole Foods. All rituals of dominance. All a way to say I am here, and I will not yield. Which, frankly, made the Wolf Court feel less like a fantasy realm and more like the worst academic department meeting she'd ever attended if everyone had claws, supernatural pheromones, and a barely concealed taste for violence. She was escorted in with all the subtlety of a guest being marched to her own execution. The chamber was long and cathedral-like, though built entirely from rough-hewn obsidian stone. No stained glass, no golden candelabras. Just jagged black walls and a floor polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting the gathered werewolves like distorted shadows. At the far end of the room, Magnus Thorne reclined on his throne of antlers, bored expression perfectly balanced between aesthetic detachment and low-grade menace. Court members flanked him in an arc, arranged not by familial bonds or academic titles, but by raw presence, how loudly their magic roared, how many enemies they'd killed, or how many lovers they'd silenced. Evelyn was the only human in the room. The only one not kneeling. She was learning. Fast. Lucien was there, but not in the way she needed him to be. He stood rigidly behind Magnus's left flank, shirtless again, apparently a theme, pale skin drawn tight over muscle, eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. His collar still pulsed dimly with runes. A leash hung loose at his side, not physically attached but present in spirit. He didn't speak. Didn't look at her. But his nostrils flared the second she stepped into the room. And when her shoulder accidentally brushed the wall and she winced, his whole body stiffened. She saw that. Magnus did, too. Interesting, the king drawled, fingers steepled as he leaned forward. Most wolves lose their instincts under silver poisoning. Lucien, however, still bristles when his human so much as flinches. Her stomach turned. He's sick. You know he is. That collar is necessary, Magnus said smoothly. His condition requires containment. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. His condition was healing just fine until you slammed a magical choke chain on his neck and dragged him across 3 miles of ice. Murmurs rippled through the court. Magnus's smile did not waver. You are not in your world anymore, Evelyn Hartwood. Here, survival is not a debate. It's an ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, his dying. This time, Lucien moved. Just a shift of weight. Barely perceptible. But enough. Magnus turned slowly toward him. Are you, brother? Lucien lifted his eyes. They weren't golden anymore. They were dim. Flickering. Like coals left too long in the ash. No, he rasped. But Evelyn heard the truth in it. He was dying. The session devolved quickly into what Evelyn could only describe as a medieval PowerPoint presentation crossed with a gladiator match. Nobles took turns posturing, reporting on border patrols, trade disputes, and the breeding stock intake numbers, which, to her horror, referred not to livestock but to human women brought in as concubines and tribute. She had to bite her tongue hard when they mentioned her name on that list. Remove her, Magnus said idly, when she finally barked out a furious objection. Let her breathe fresh air before her science melts into hysteria. 2 guards escorted her out again. But not before she caught one last glance at Lucien. He was watching her now. And his eyes, dim as they were, held a promise. Soon. They didn't return her to the lower chambers this time. Instead, she was led into a sunlit courtyard walled by obsidian columns and hung with creeping vines that seemed to grow without soil. An older woman waited there, seated calmly at a stone table covered in scrolls, herbs, and an alarming number of sharp instruments. You're early, she said, voice dry but not unkind. I wasn't aware I had an appointment, Evelyn replied, scanning the instruments. Unless you're my werewolf dentist. The woman didn't smile, but her green eyes twinkled. I am Anthea. Seer of the Wolf Court. High Priestess. And, for today, your only advocate. Right, Evelyn muttered. Because that always bodes well. Anthea gestured for her to sit. Lucien is not dying. Not yet. But he's resisting the collar. His mind wants to remember. His body wants to forget. Evelyn sat stiffly. And what, you think a little conversation will fix that? No, Anthea said. But you might. Evelyn looked up sharply. Me? You are a mirror. Something ancient in him sees you. His bond isn't just instinct. It's memory. Legacy. Destiny. Great. Love a good prophecy. Anything I should know before I accidentally fulfill it. Anthea reached across the table, placing something cold and silver into Evelyn's hand. A pendant. Worn. Familiar. Shaped like a crescent moon over a stylized flame. Evelyn's breath caught. I've seen this, she whispered. In your dreams, Anthea said softly. Or perhaps, in another life. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the charm. Lucian was sick. And she was being watched. But suddenly, she wasn't just surviving this court. She was becoming part of it. For a kingdom that practically carved dominance into its stone walls, Ironfang Keep had surprisingly porous security, at least if one knew how to walk like they belonged. Evelyn had observed enough over the past day to understand the basic behavioral economy here. Wolves respected confidence, hierarchy, and silence. Act like prey, and you were devoured. Move like a predator, and they didn't look twice. So she walked calmly, purposefully, with her chin tilted slightly upward and her arms relaxed at her sides, like a woman who had memorized the architecture and wasn't the slightest bit afraid of its claws. In truth, she was vibrating with a cocktail of dread and adrenaline. Lucian was somewhere in this labyrinth of stone and secrets. And if Magnus wouldn't let her see him, she'd find a way herself. The memory of his face in the court still haunted her, too pale, too quiet, too distant. As if some vital part of him was pulling inward to escape the pull of the collar. Or perhaps, more devastatingly, as if that collar had already begun severing who he was from who he used to be. She had seen enough neurological degradation in trauma patients to recognize the signs: dissociation, fatigue, muscle rigidity. But what she didn't yet understand, what made it so infuriating, was how magic interacted with physiology. There were no control groups, no double-blind studies, no baseline data. Just rituals, runes, and centuries of violent guesswork. Her fingers brushed the silver pendant Anthea had given her, now hidden under her tunic. She didn't trust the seer. But she trusted Lucian's pain. She found him in the East Wing, past a pair of disinterested guards and a hall lined with murals that depicted wolves mating, mauling, and mourning in equal measure. It was all unnecessarily theatrical, in her opinion, like someone had commissioned a fantasy artist during a breakup and never given them closure. The chamber door wasn't locked. Which seemed absurd. Until she realized it wasn't locked because it didn't need to be. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the flickering embers in the hearth. The stone walls breathed cold, but the bed, massive, unmade, more like a den than a sleeping place, radiated heat. Lucian lay across it, half curled in a fetal position, his torso bare, sweat slicking the hollow of his throat. The collar glowed faintly, casting pale light across his clavicle. He didn't stir when she entered. "Lucian," she said softly. Still nothing. She stepped closer, cautiously, aware of how wrong this might look, how vulnerable he was, how easily this could turn into a scene of intrusion. But her heart wouldn't let her leave him there, broken and alone, not when she had watched him bleed, protect, trust. She sank slowly onto the edge of the bed. "Lucian," she tried again, louder this time. His eyes cracked open. And for a moment, she didn't see recognition, only pain. Then, slowly, his gaze focused. "Evelyn," he rasped. She exhaled, unsteady. "You remember." He blinked slowly. "You smell afraid." She laughed, a quiet, breathy thing. "Of course I'm afraid. You're shackled by a magical wolf collar in a kingdom full of predators who don't blink at the word tribute. Forgive me if I'm not brimming with optimism." Lucian's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "You shouldn't be here. Magnus said the same thing. I mean it." She reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of the collar. "This thing is killing you." His hand clamped around her wrist, gentle, but firm. "Not killing," he whispered. "Binding." Her brows knit. "To what?" He hesitated. "To who I was." A pause, heavy. "To what I could become." Evelyn stared at him. "Then we have to get it off." He shook his head. "It's tied to my blood. My magic. My inheritance. If it's removed before I'm ready, I could turn feral. Or worse. Define worse. I could forget you." Her breath caught. "Forget myself. Forget us. If there was an us." She stared at him, jaw clenched. There was an us. Maybe there still is. Lucian looked away. Evelyn pressed her hand to his chest, over the beat of his heart. "Tell me what to do. I'm not just going to sit around and watch you unravel." His hand came up slowly, covering hers. "Stay," he said. That was all. "Not save me. Not fix this. Just stay." And she did. She stayed long enough to gather the basin of cool water from the stone corner, long enough to press a damp cloth to his brow and whisper stories from her world about cell theory and microwave popcorn, about how blood carried memory in more ways than just DNA. He listened, barely conscious, and when he drifted off, she didn't leave. She sat beside him on the edge of the bed, watching his breathing stabilize, watching the glow of the collar flicker with each pulse like it, too, was listening. There was so much she didn't understand. But this she knew. Lucien wasn't a monster. He was a man shackled by expectation and pain, locked in a system that valued dominance over healing, obedience over memory. And Evelyn? She wasn't going to let that system keep him. Chapter 6 Ancient Markings. Evelyn had never believed in reincarnation. Not seriously, anyway. She'd once taken a BuzzFeed quiz at 2 in the morning that claimed she'd been a 14th century Flemish cartographer with unresolved control issues, but that was about as far as her spiritual credibility went. She'd always preferred things she could touch, analyze, classify, things with variables, constants, the occasional Nobel-winning citation. So naturally, she found it vaguely insulting to be standing in a subterranean temple beneath a werewolf fortress, staring at a wall covered in glowing runes that seemed to know her name. Fascinating, isn't it? Anthea's voice echoed against the stone, smooth and almost fond. Our ancestors called this place Vel Arduin, the breath of the beginning. It's where the first wolfkin were marked. Where Daisy made her pact. Evelyn turned slowly. Right. Daisy. The witch I may or may not be the second coming of. Anthea smiled enigmatically. You're not her second coming. More like, her echo. Echo, Evelyn repeated, dryly. That's appropriately vague. Reverberations of a spirit don't return unchanged, the seer replied. You are not her. But you are shaped by what she left behind. The room smelled of moss and ancient dust. The air thrummed not with sound, but with potential, like some molecular memory was humming just beneath her skin. The walls were covered in curved symbols that pulsed faintly, shifting between languages she didn't know but somehow understood. She reached out, brushing her fingers over one of the carvings. It flared beneath her touch. I don't like that, she muttered. Your blood remembers, Anthea said simply. Evelyn turned. So what does that mean, exactly? That I'm some long-dead matriarch's Wi-Fi router? Anthea laughed softly. It means you've been here before. And the keep remembers you. They walked slowly through the chamber. The runes lit as she passed, faint and spectral, like fireflies following her movement. She wanted to be skeptical, was actively reaching for cynicism like a security blanket, but something about this place made logic feel thin. Like the stone around her was older than equations, older than doubt. This chamber predates Magnus's reign, Anthea explained, brushing her fingers over a wolf-shaped carving. Even before the first crown was forged, the wolves followed her voice. Daisies? The seer nodded. She created the first bond between beast and spirit. Not through power, but sacrifice. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. What kind of sacrifice? Anthea was quiet for a moment. Then, herself. Entirely. Evelyn paused in front of a section of the wall depicting a woman surrounded by wolves. She had a crown of moonlight and flame, her hands outstretched. The wolves were not snarling. They were kneeling. Why would anyone give everything for them? She asked, mostly to herself. She loved them, Anthea said softly. Or at least one of them. Evelyn's chest tightened. Lucien had not been allowed to accompany her to the chamber. Something about magical resonance and unpredictable soul links. But he lingered on her mind like a scent, burnt wood, frost, and that specific wild spice that now lived behind her ribs like a secret. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her the night before. Not possessive, not even grateful. Just aware. As if some piece of him had returned from wherever the silver had buried it. She'd sat with him until he slept. Talked nonsense to keep herself sane. Held his hand because he didn't ask her to let go. And now, standing beneath a ceiling of ancient symbols, Evelyn realized that everything she'd chalked up to coincidence, the dreams, the pendant, even Lucien's pull toward her, might actually mean something. Or, more terrifyingly, everything. Your dreams, Anthea said gently. What do you see? Evelyn hesitated. Wolves. Always wolves. And fire. And a field covered in bones. Anthea nodded as if that confirmed a theory she'd already tested 1,000 times. That is Daisy's death dream. The memory that passed into her bloodline. Evelyn blinked. That's specific. You are her legacy. Whether you want to be or not. That made Evelyn stiffen. No offense, but I'm not in the habit of fulfilling destiny without informed consent. The seer smiled. No one is asking you to. Could have fooled me, Evelyn muttered, stepping closer to the center of the chamber. The stones beneath her feet were etched with a circular pattern. A familiar one. From her dream. She'd stood here before. And burned. The vision came before she even registered the flicker. A rush of heat, sound, motion. Not her body, someone else's. A woman in robes of black and ivory, barefoot, marked with blood. She stood at the altar, chanting words Evelyn didn't recognize but somehow understood. Around her, wolves howled not in pain, but in unison. At her side, a man knelt. Black-haired. Gold-eyed. Lucian. But not him. Older. Wilder. Radiating power like it was his skin. His lips moved, please, don't leave me, but the woman only smiled. This is the only way. Then flame. Then ash. Then silence. Evelyn staggered backward, heart slamming in her chest. Anthea was beside her in a heartbeat, steadying her with a firm grip. You saw it, the seer said. Evelyn nodded, breath ragged. I saw her. You are not Daisy, Anthea said again, her tone sharper now. But she sleeps in your blood. And that means the bond has awakened. Evelyn's hands trembled. The bond with Lucian? Anthea tilted her head. Yes. And with the world she tried to save. Evelyn's gaze returned to the carvings. She wasn't a witch. She wasn't a hero. But something ancient had chosen her. And Lucian, whoever he used to be, was part of that choice. By the time Evelyn returned to Lucian's chambers, she felt like she'd been peeled open emotionally, psychically, and maybe spiritually, though she was still resisting that last possibility with the stubbornness of a woman who once corrected her therapist's Latin etymology mid-panic attack. She lingered in the doorway, unsure if she was more afraid of what she'd seen in the vision or what she felt in response to it. Because something about that fire-drenched memory had been personal. Not like watching history unfold. Not like a detached playback of someone else's life. It had been hers. A memory encoded so deeply in her bones it bypassed reason, curled up in the marrow, and whispered remember. And worst of all, it made her ache. Lucian was sitting upright when she entered. That alone nearly undid her. His back was braced against the wall, a thick fur draped over his lap. His skin still held the dull sheen of fever, but his eyes had brightened. Not quite gold. Not quite healed. But alert. Present. He looked up when she entered. The faintest ghost of a smile curved the edge of his mouth. You're warm, he murmured, voice still gravelly. Evelyn blinked. Is that a euphemism or an observation? He considered it. Both. She snorted and stepped into the room. Well, someone's personality survived the magical poisoning. He shifted slightly as she approached. I remember your voice. Evelyn froze. Now or before? Lucian's gaze didn't waver. Both. She exhaled, carefully setting the pendant Anthea had given her on the table. I went to the old temple. The seer thought it would help. It did. No, she said honestly. It gave me visions of myself burning alive and a cryptic lecture about spiritual inheritance, so I'd classify the experience as deeply unhelpful, bordering on emotionally destabilizing. Lucian's lip twitched. You survived it. You're assuming I haven't completely unraveled. I'd know, he said quietly. I'd feel it. There it was again, that soft, unsettling gravity he spoke with. Like the connection between them wasn't emotional or metaphorical, but anatomical. Biological. Like some thread buried in their DNA was tugging taut, humming with shared memory. She sat down beside him on the edge of the bed, eyes scanning the collar around his throat. You're lucid. That's good. But this thing, she gestured to the rune-lined silver, is still eating you from the inside. Lucian nodded slowly. It dampens what I am. Makes it harder to lose control. But it also dulls. Dulls. He searched for the word. Color. Sound. You. Evelyn's heart stuttered. You mean you can't feel me? I can, he said, gaze piercing. But only in moments. Like light through frost. She reached up, hesitated, then placed her fingers gently against the collar's edge. The metal didn't burn her, but it hummed faintly like it was alive. Repelling her touch, just barely. A defense mechanism. Like Lucian himself. We need to find a way to break this, she whispered. No, he said, catching her wrist. Not yet. You're deteriorating. I need to remember first. Evelyn stared at him. Why? Because if I don't know who I am, he said, voice quiet but steady, I don't know who I might become when it's gone. She swallowed. You're afraid you'll hurt me. I already have, he murmured. You're here. That means you've already paid a price. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. He was right, of course. She'd given up her world. Her safety. Her rational framework for reality. But what she hadn't lost, what she refused to lose, was the choice to be here. I'm not a prize, she said finally. I'm not part of some mystical mating lottery, and I'm not just Daisy's shadow. I'm Evelyn. I'm here because I choose to be. Lucian blinked. Even now? Especially now. He reached out then, slowly, fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. Like she was something sacred, or breakable. Or both. You smell like her, he said softly. But your voice, it's new. Do you remember her? Evelyn asked. He closed his eyes. Only in dreams. She was fire. And grief. Evelyn swallowed. She died for them. For you. I know. His hand dropped. And now you're here. Again. I'm not her, Evelyn repeated. But I might be her second chance. Lucian opened his eyes, and this time, they were fully golden. Alive. Burning. He leaned in, not quite touching her. Not yet. But are you mine? Evelyn didn't answer. Not because she didn't know. But because something in her, something buried deep, was already saying yes. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and subscribe for more beautiful tales. Tap the next thumbnail to continue your journey.